This is what I wanted to do, obviously, to give you a half-day seminar on just how fantastic we are. That was declined. So what I'm going to do instead is to give you two stories on where I believe we can add value. But before I do that, let me just provide just a little bit of context, given that we're now Outbrain. And I was, and probably still is to some extent, the CEO and founder of a company called Visual Revenue, which we founded back July 5th, 2010 at 8 o'clock, to be very precise. And we spent a good 3.5 years trying to figure out exactly how to help publishers, whether that be the Kansas City Star, Fox News, or CNN, program their homepage or their section front page. And I think we ended up being pretty good at it. I'll speak to exactly how we chose to approach that. Then in March this year, March 6th at 5:03, we got acquired. And as you will notice, I was obviously one of the major stockholders. So if you don't know what happy looks like, this is it. Take a picture and print it out. And since March, we've tried to kind of integrate our technology with that of Outbrain's. And Outbrain have been in the market for the last good half decade. And if you go to, say, CNN or Fox, and you read that given story, what you'll see is that below the article, or in the right-hand side, there'll be a set of links called, you might also like, around the web, and so on and so forth. That set of recommendations they provide. Some of those are internal and are just good, solid recommendations for what you might do next. We have this idea of us being that page turner on the internet, which says, I've read one story, which might be about the Middle East. That doesn't mean that I want to read another 10 stories around the Middle East. I actually just want to turn the page and see what's next. That's what they do. But before I even arrive there, and before I fall in love with the Kansas City Star, or CNN, or Fast Company, I need to have a destination which is so lovable that I remember it and will actually come back to it. And what we believed, and I still believe is true, is that that homepage, or that section front page, certainly serves as a good starting point for that relationship. And with that, let me just kind of tell you where in this picture I believe we fit. And this is not to say that any one of these boxes or segments are better than the other one, but this is certainly how we looked at it when we started out. And I spent 10 years in what you might define as traditional web analytics before we started VR. So this whole idea of collecting as much clickstream data as you can, whether that be through core metrics, web trends, Armature, free Google Analytics, and store that forever. So that when you have a question on whether that given campaign from Outbrain did actually yield the results that we had hoped for, or that new section, or that initiative that we actually started 2 months ago, did that work out? And for that, I don't think you can run any type of online property, whether in media, retail, or travel, or what have you, without having that in place. I am not so sure that whatever real-time analytics or predictive analytics that we can apply to media, that is supposed to replace this. We've certainly never tried to compete with any one of these solutions and never tried to steal budget from them, even though I competed with Armature for half a decade and I fucking hated them. I've come to kind of live for the fact that they're there, and I think they do a splendid job at doing just that for the past. Then over the last, I would say, 3-4 years, I'm sure you would agree, what we've seen is actually that industry here, which ended up being pretty consolidated with very few vendors, something changed simply because they didn't provide, I think, enough information on what was going on right now, this instant. We can then discuss, what this instant, what does that mean, and how rapid do I need the information, and in what format. But there's certainly a whole plethora of tools coming out, whether that be Parsley, Chartbeats, we provide some of that information. But that was I think, new genre of analytics, and it just fitted so well, I believe, with media, given that the window of opportunity is so small. So if you work at Expedia and you want to optimize your checkout page, you can spend weeks in setting up the experiments. You can spend a month in running the experiment. You can spend 2 months in actually taking action on the conclusion, because the output of you optimizing that kind of funnel is going to yield tens of millions of dollars for Expedia. In media, though, a story comes in, you write it at 11 a.m., and at 5 p.m., that story is out. And if you haven't done anything with that specific story in that kind of window, it just disappears. That SKU or that specific kind of product ID, it just disappears. It doesn't matter anymore. It falls into the archive, and there might be some long-tail traffic on it, and that's fine. But that window of opportunity is typically something which you would need different tools for. We tried to, and I'll let our customers kind of be the judge of whether we succeeded in working from not so much what's going on right now, we certainly provide that information, but more on what's going on right now and what can we help you with to optimize the next 10 minutes, the next half hour, the next 2 hours. Because I think that is crucial for you to make the most of the content for which you're already taking the cost in producing. There's no going back on that part. And say you're the New York Daily News and you produce 150-something original stories every day, how do you make sure that you make the most of those 150 stories? So that's the space that we play in. And the way we play in that space, and I'll give you two features. One is that we actually provide recommendations on what action we believe the editor should take, such as take that story on what Assad did yesterday, which you wrote 17 minutes ago, and put that into the hero spot. And if you're willing to do so, you stand to make an additional 17,000 page views. That is pretty concise. So concise that I've been punched in the face for the first year that we started the company, because Philippe, the editor-in-chief of Le Monde, don't want to hear of it. Ted at the New York Daily, what the fuck are you talking about? And at some point, they figure out perhaps he's not trying to dictate. Perhaps he's actually just trying to participate in a discussion that we're already having. So this is not a setting where it's not being discussed what goes into the hero, or what goes into the local news box, or what goes into the sports box. This is a discussion that they're having as we speak. But perhaps you could apply data to that without having data dictate what goes there. And that's what we tried to do. And I think, once I got punched in the face 100 times, I changed my vocabulary slightly, and they somewhat figured out that we were there to empower, I think is the right way to put it. But I want to speak about one specific feature that we've brought to market as well, which I think kind of plays in that space on what can we do to kind of affect the future, which is headline testing. And I think when most people think of headline testing or testing the imagery or testing the abstract or any type of testing which you apply, that is simply some sort of run towards the lowest common denominator. And I think for some that might have been the case. Go no further than say Gawker or Business Insider or somebody like that. And I think they're lovable destinations, but they've certainly figured out how to get me to click, if only have me land on a page where I figured out she's not naked. Why the heck did you? So that said, I think you can actually do testing in a way that is somewhat opposite to this general idea of this just being a race towards the bottom. And I want to give you these two stories of two clients of ours. So usually the way the interface looks is like this. This is from, and I'm allowed to share this data before you think I'm completely crazy. So from JS Online, it's real data. They're running these 16,000 something views an hour. About half of them click into a story. They figure out there's a story here which is kind of in their lead slot number 1 and is slightly below the expected target that we have for that story in that position on that day at that time. And the editor knows that because I've told him. So he could either just sit there and be angry, kill the story, or stand up and defend that story. And that's exactly how we would like them to use testing. So the two stories are, most of the time, what we've seen is that they obviously go in and use the feature as is, take the gain, and what you'll think is, why wouldn't you just take the 5 or 10% increase? But that's actually not what we see. There tends to be a dramatic effect on the same story in the same position for the same audience with a slightly different title, or a slightly different abstract, or a new image. Typically in the 40, 50, 60, 70% increase or decrease, by the way. But this one client, not JS Online here, what they've done, and I think this is very interesting, is that they have a schedule, which is typically every good fortnight. They actually download all of the tests, which we obviously store, and actually go through every single one of them Why? Two reasons. One, they want to make sure that when they go out and start writing the new original headline come next month, they're just a little bit sharper on how they're supposed to communicate to their audience. And I think that's interesting. It actually becomes, if you think about it, it becomes harder and harder for them to beat the original headline, simply because they get better and better at writing it. The second one is, how do you actually educate new editors or new content producers coming into your organization? So we sat, again, inside the newsroom of the New York Daily News for a year as we initially kind of developed the product, and then the next 2 years inside the newsroom of the Associated Press. That education pretty much consists of kind of hitting people at the back of the head. That's a stupid headline. And they learn over time that that was perhaps a stupid headline. What you could do instead is you can print this out and say, here is some sort of a feedback loop between us and our readers. If you read through this, you can see how we best speak to our audience. And we've seen that they actually start handing this out. Read these 300 headlines, because once you get to the end, you'll have some sort of understanding and kind of taste of how we would like to speak to them. And I think that's interesting. I'm actually a huge fan of that. And I think they could do so much more on trying to distill that into a set of guidelines for how they communicate. That's the one part. The other story I want to tell is a good 4 months ago, we had a set of Muppets doing something awful in Boston, and a whole sad set of stories coming out of it, obviously. And what happened, the local destination there is also a customer of ours, is that I just assumed that for that week, I would disappear, and I would actually be okay with it. It's not for me to go tout my data story. It was for them to go do their thing and do it well. But that week was actually the week that there was the most active on the platform ever. And I was actually a little bit surprised to kind of see that, because I thought it would be, turn everything off and let's just kind of figure out how to best tell this story. What they did was they all of a sudden had a surge of visitors who actually went there to have a story told that they thought they could get only from this destination. And they needed to start changing the way they spoke to these people, because they were, like me, obviously not from around there. And sometimes you can't just use specific places in Boston if I live in London. You need to be slightly more elaborate. I don't know where Back Bay is. You need to tell me exactly where that is. I'm not so sure that I know these street names or these monuments or the end of where this actually happened. And they actually went in and started testing things and figured out, is this too specific? Or do I need to kind of broaden this? Or don't I even need to say anything about this being in South Boston? I need to just be open and clear that this was actually, in the city of Boston. Furthermore, they started testing out something I think which is very obvious. I can't use the name of the offender on that very first story. But when can you? I can't say brothers until people are aware of the fact that they're actually brothers. I can't figure out, who's the younger one, who's the older one. But at some point in time, people have read enough stories for them to learn that. And they started slowly testing that. Some days they were a little bit too early on when they thought that most of their audience have been educated on a given subject matter, and they just kind of rolled that back and stuck with one concept one day further. Then they tested it again and say, now they know, and I could be even more succinct in the story which I'm trying to tell here. And I think those two stories are very good examples of something which I personally don't believe will be something that's a race towards the bottom. One, better education for your editors. Two, a better way of trying to figure out when you can elaborate or tune a story to a unique set of visitors coming to your site. This was the biased version, obviously. What I'm hoping is you're going to get the unbiased version from our friends at the Kansas City Star. Thank you very much.